This right here is the brand new Palethius Comp V1, and it's a completely new direction for Palethius, who mainly focuses on the handmade attention to detail stuff, textures, custom colors, and anything to make the knife look like an art piece. This is a completely different direction though, and is a knife that Palethius designed from the ground up to be more function over form. Performance over looks, if you will. And today we're going to find out if that's exactly what he did. So go ahead and press the like button, and also huge shout out to Pyro Flipper for letting me get in on this pass round. If you guys are at all curious about trying a knife that you might want to buy in the future, or trying a knife that you're just overall curious about and want to just try for a week, always hop in on the pass round. It literally takes nothing but a comment and some money to be able to send the knife to the next person. So shout out to Pyro Flipper again. Thank you for letting me try out this knife. Now let's get on to the review. The Comp V1. This is a competition performance flipper designed for functionality over form, which again is something Palethius doesn't normally do. So what do you get with this knife? Well, because you're focusing on more function, there are obviously removal of unnecessary features. In fact, Palethius has gone so far to say that anything that did not add functionality or performance to this knife while keeping it to be the price point was not considered. So this knife is $550 and again is focused more on performance parts, and he is really honing in on that because again, apparently anything that wasn't performance or function related was just not considered while keeping it in the price point. Was this a good decision to add a hollow grind though? I feel like that is definitely more aesthetic than function. Hollow grinds are great for actually cutting and slicing, but for flipping, hollow grind, isn't necessarily required, but it is still cool to have. It does make this knife a little bit more unique than just some regular performance flippers out there. However, there is a small inconsistency with it. That is really caused by this knife being hand finished and handmade. A lot of Palethius knives are handmade, especially their blades. This is a D2 steel blade, and it has a nice hollow grind, but towards the tip of the blade here, there is a small difference on the other side. You can just notice that the hollow grind is just a bit more, taller and a bit peakier on the other side than it is on, well, the other side. And it's just a little bit noticeable. That's pretty much the only, inconsistency that I've seen on this knife as far as the handmade stuff. Everywhere else is actually pretty well uniform and symmetrical, so I don't really have any other inconsistencies to show you besides that. Everything else also is actually pretty well improved on quality standards, and especially again with the symmetry. A lot of Palethius knives I've had in the past had their handles finished by hand and stuff on a bench grinder or a bench sander. You would always notice these lines where you could see him pressing the handle into the belt or into the wheel, and it would be varied on the other handle. So it's good to see that there's a lack of that, a lack of those handmade inconsistencies. And honestly, that's a huge thumbs up for me because that's the standard we should be seeing now, especially at the $500 price point. But speaking of quality standard, let's talk about the handles, which are pretty nice. These are nice titanium sandwich constructed handles. And as you can see, they're pretty well free flowing right here. And we'll speak on the tolerances in a minute, but these are sandwich constructed and they have screwed in Zen pins, which are using T6 screws, and the other screws in the body are also T6, apart from the main pivot screws, which are T10 and are not double-sided. They're just using a standard bolt. This is running on bushings and bronze phosphorus washers. To give you guys a bit of a hint of what the tolerances are like, I guess I'll give you a tap test. Not that great, but we'll talk about it in a minute. Let's continue talking about the looks, which unfortunately I can't really say much about. Honestly, I feel like the looks of this are a little bit more subtle and definitely, it's definitely function over form for sure. There's just a huge slot in the handles, and they are kind of contoured in the center. They have a nice little divot down here to give it some kind of depth and grip right here in this giant slot. But besides that, there's really not much to note by the handles, except for the very symmetrical titanium spacers that have a contour on either side of the handle, which is a little bit less traditional than other knives. Typically, spacers just have a contour on the inside of the handle to prevent the blade from smacking into the spacers. So yeah, it's interesting to see symmetrical spacers. These also come with aluminum spacers. However, I will never use them. They're there if you want to use the option. They come installed with titanium ones, which I prefer more. But yeah, these are pretty much it for the looks. Not really much else to say. besides how thick the blade is, which also has kind of a negative effect on the balance but we'll talk about that in a second. There was one thing I wanted to mention though about some hot spots. There are like noticeable milling marks and rough milling marks on the inside of the handle here in this big slot. So, you know, those could be touched up. Those are pretty much the only complaints I have for the handles, and pretty much everything else except for the exaggerated Zen pin notch, which is a little bit rough and took a bit of adjustment to get used to. But besides that, I haven't really been pinched or anything, or, you know, scraped or cut by anything that isn't the actual edge of this knife, which I also must say, even though it is a D2 steel, and I feel like should be, you know, we should be given a little bit better quality steel than D2 at this price point. But I'm not going to complain about it. It probably is easier in the handmade aspect to use D2. Yeah, there's a nice scratch on the blade here from the blade rubbing against the inside of the handle. In the looks department, this knife is actually pretty plain looking. In fact, I feel like it's a little bit too plain. It kind of lacks a bit of identity from Pale. It honestly, I could probably name 3 knives that look pretty similar to this. You could say a couple of other knives have similar looking handles, but I think it's just because the knife has this very basic handle look. I feel like it is pretty good at achieving the lightweight aspect of it. Speaking of which, the knife is 4.1 ounces, so this knife is a lot lighter than traditional Palethius knives, which I will give the thumbs up to. So far, it's going in the right direction to be a performance flipper, but is it? And that's where we go in on the flipping portion. So this is where I always, you know, stop the information and stuff and the bombarding of specs to just flip the knife for a bit. So please join me for a flipping sesh. Okay, so I have some small complaints overall with the flipping experience. Even though these have the heaviest spacer options in it, this knife is very blade biased. And it's honestly so much so that you have to flip this knife very gentle in order to get it into a proper flow. It's kind of like the blade just wants to keep moving, but the handles cannot keep up with the knife. Overall though, I managed to actually make this knife flow pretty well, and I've been getting used to it more as I flip it. But that's pretty much with every single knife, honestly. And I still find myself slipping up because of how heavy the blade is, but I really do think it's because of how thick this blade is. I think the easiest fix for this knife would just be to make it thinner, or maybe take off some weight like right here or something, like maybe add like a faux edge or like maybe a contour right here, and that would reduce some of the weight and maybe make it more neutral. Besides that, the other complaint that I have is the tolerances. The tolerances are not that good at all. It taps a lot, and the screws are cranked. Pretty much every screw on this knife is cranked. I like when I got this out of the box, the blade was rubbing against its handle, which I kind of solved a little bit. The tolerances are still poor, but it's still rubbing the blade on the handle, but it's better now. The blade is a little bit more centered in the safe side of the handle, like what it was doing before. And the reason why it has that small line on the flat of this blade right here was because whenever the knife would close, it would literally scrape itself as it would close. And because of that, I went in and like just swapped the washers around to see if that was making any difference. And I think that was making some difference, but it's still rubbing and the tolerances are still not that great. There's still plenty of tap, and like noticeable amounts of play. It's not super bad and not very noticeable. Jeez. Sorry for that loud noise, but speaking of noise, that's actually where the compliments to this knife actually start. This knife sounds really good. I actually think it sounds great, actually. Let's take a listen to it. Besides the tolerances and besides the kind of more than needed blade bias, I don't really have many complaints with this knife. I feel like maybe an added detail to the blade up top here where this flat spine is could, you know, reduce some weight. Maybe honestly a Bowie version of this would be better as far as balance goes. Or maybe just make the spacers a little bit bigger, make it a little bit heavier in the rear so that it has a more neutral balance. The quality, I think, has definitely been improved. The weight, for sure, is ideal. The price for some of the materials isn't exactly the greatest thing ever. Overall, if I had to give this knife a score just off of everything on it, I would have to say it's honestly like... I'm leaning like a 6.5 on this one. D2 steel is not exactly ideal for $500. There are knives pretty much around the same price point that are giving you S35 VN and better tolerances out of the box anyways. Plus, the balance is not that great. It's too blade biased for me to like really want to get used to. And I commonly mess up because of like how thick and heavy the blade is on this knife. It just kind of throws it out of balance a little bit. I feel like this knife does need a little bit of improvement, but the quality and standards for it are definitely showing to go up, which is a good thing for sure. Right now at this price point, I personally don't think I would buy this knife. It's definitely really cool. It sounds great. And it does feel high quality. Like, I never said at all that it wasn't solidly sound. This knife is nutty. Like, on closing, it feels amazing. But yeah, honestly, this knife isn't as good as I thought it was going to be. I thought this knife could be a little bit better. And honestly, if there is a V2 coming out with, you know, needed improvements to make this knife a little bit more neutral, a little bit more comfortable, and better tolerances, then I am actually here for it and ready to try that out. So anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Tune in next time for the next review. Peace out.